Welcome to Passages Pulse, where we track the heartbeat of Israel and the Middle East from a Christian perspective. In a time of confusion, division, and misinformation, we're here to help you cut through the noise with truth, clarity, and conviction. Hi everyone, welcome to the Passages Pulse. At the time of this recording, it is Wednesday, October 1st, new month. It is 11 a.m. Eastern Time at the time of this recording. I'm your co-host, Sebastian. I'm here with my co-host, Josiah McGee. How's it going, Josiah?
It's going well. I hope you're doing well too, Sebastian.
Yeah, I've been reflecting on what a time it has been to start this podcast. I feel like we have a lot of really big deals happening since we started the podcast. So I'm glad that it's timely and it's been helpful to people. What do you think about that, about how we're doing so far?
Yeah, I'm happy with like you said, just the timing of when we chose to start this podcast, everything that's happened since. I hope that it is helpful for people because I don't know about listeners. Some days it feels like there's just so much information coming out, so many headlines, so many stories. It's hard to know some weeks what to talk about on the podcast because there's so much we could talk about. But I think it's been helpful for me at least to have a space to discuss some of these things with you, Sebastian, and hopefully it's been helpful to the listeners as well.
Yeah, and we've been seeing your comments. Audience, thank you so much for sending your comments. And in this podcast at the end, we're going to go over some of those questions that you guys have sent us. So please stick with us to the end. We're going to address them. But this week, another huge week, President Trump held a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu at the White House this week on Monday. The president announced a 20-point plan for a permanent end to the war in Gaza, and the status the day after, something that has been discussed a lot. What is the day after going to look like? This plan has a complete end, not a ceasefire, and a day after plan. So we're going to unpack the plan a little bit and discuss its chances of success, because we've been here before, and honestly, we have been in conferences like last summer where we're going to bring Israelis to speak at a conference, and we were like, well, what if there's a deal before that? And then, my friend, our speakers have to go home. I feel like this is really different, and we're going to unpack why. So we will cover questions at the end, like I said. So let's get started. Josiah, tell us about this 20-point plan. Can you unpack it for our listeners, please?
Yeah, I mean, it's 20 points, so I'm not going to go through the entire thing because it's much faster if you just read it for yourself, but we will draw out a few of the highlights and things that are most notable about this plan because it is a pretty big deal. I just want to respond very briefly to something you said, Sebastian, that we've been here before. I understand what you're trying to say, but I would maybe disagree with you. I don't think we've been here before because this deal is so different than the previous deals where all of them previously were ceasefire deals. They were short term. They were for a specific number of hostages, typically not all of them. And there was no real day after element to most of those negotiations or proposals. They were at best very surface level. And there's still some pretty big holes in this plan, frankly, that need to be discussed and hammered out. But I think this is totally different than most of the previous proposals that were put on the table because it is a permanent deal. It's for all of the hostages, and it has a significant amount to say about what happens after the war in Gaza actually ends, which has been a key point of frustration between the U.S. administration, between the Israelis, and other actors in the region. So just a few quick highlights for everyone. One, I think it starts with all the hostages. That's one of the first steps, and that's a pretty key indicator of whether or not Hamas is serious or not, is whether they actually follow through with that first step, because the first step essentially required in order to implement this deal is the release of all Israel's hostages within 72 hours. That includes all of the live hostages and all of the remains or bodies of those who have been deceased since October 7. So that's a big deal. That's all the hostages. Again, a pretty significant difference from previous deals. It's going to put in place something that Israel has been demanding for some time, which is that Gaza is demilitarized, not just that Hamas demilitarizes.
Sorry, before you move into that, I just wanted to add that
Yep.
all the hostages, to me, it is a big deal. Because remember the last time the Witkoff plan was 10 hostages out of the 20 that are alive for like a 2-month pause. And I thought at the time that was way too much of a price to pay. But we knew that Hamas is an evil terrorist organization that was going to hold on to the last hostages for leverage. Yeah, just wanted to say this is like the tables have changed. Israel and the president of the United States are like, we're going to start with all the hostages, period, and then we'll move on. But yeah, there is a demilitarization plan as well.
Right. And this is where things get interesting in that it's quite a bit that still needs to be unpacked. We'll maybe get into that a few minutes later. But I think what the highlights are that you're going to want to be aware of is that it's a demilitarization of the Gaza Strip. In theory, not just of Hamas, but of the Strip as a whole. So it means that Hamas members are required to decommission their weapons, to surrender them essentially. And there are various elements of the plan which call for destruction of weapons or weapons production, even in the Gaza Strip. So it's a pretty comprehensive plan to demilitarize the Gaza Strip, something that would be a very tough sell to Hamas, but Israel has been demanding for quite some time. It also puts in place this idea that there would be an international stabilization force. So this is one of those components about the day after that has been discussed for quite a while, but no one had really been able to put together some sort of proposal for what it would look like. Who's actually going to oversee the disarming of Hamas and security in the Gaza Strip after the end of the war? And what's been put forward is the idea that there's an international stabilization force that draws on various quote unquote regional partners or things like that, Arab countries. Probably what you're looking at is some combination of the Emiratis and the Egyptians with the help potentially or consultation of the Jordanians, something like that. So Arab countries from around the region are supposedly supposed to step up and take over some sort of role in ensuring the ongoing security of the Gaza Strip. One of the things that is also in place that Israel's been demanding for some time is that they don't have to entirely leave the Gaza Strip. They have to get out, but they don't have to leave it entirely. So, again, maybe a little bit later we can unpack where that line is or what that necessarily looks like. Hamas is going to be out effectively if this plan is implemented. They're not going to be allowed to continue to govern the Gaza Strip. There is supposed to be a transitional committee of quote unquote apolitical Palestinians, technocratic committee who would govern the day-to-day of the Gaza Strip and is not supposed to include Hamas. So Hamas, in theory, would lose both its military capacity and its authority to govern the Gaza Strip as a part of this plan. Any members of Hamas, this I did think was very interesting, who are willing to abide by this plan and accept a new peaceful way forward, do have an offer on the table as part of this plan for amnesty or even for safe passage out of the Gaza Strip if they would prefer to leave and go somewhere else. So that's very interesting. I mean, this is creating a world in which Gaza, after the end of the war, would be governed by Palestinians, secured by some combination of Emirati or Egyptian forces, and in theory, Hamas members could stay if they promise to behave themselves, basically, and be given amnesty. So it's a really interesting situation. It's certainly not exactly as Israel would have drawn it up, because that's a pretty volatile situation potentially, but it is one in which, at least hypothetically, Hamas would lose a lot of its power and authority. The apolitical committee I've already mentioned. I think it is also important to clarify some rumors flying around that Tony Blair would be sort of like the governor of Gaza. I think that's not exactly correct, but it is a little bit, it's important to clarify. He would be involved in some capacity, but it's maybe a little bit more nuanced than him being the governor of Gaza, if you will. What's in place essentially as part of the process of building this transitional political committee is that there would be an international board of peace made up of different heads of state or leaders around the world who are throwing their backing behind this idea, probably throwing some of their country's money behind the idea, who would oversee the transitional committee and basically hold it accountable to make the necessary reforms or to govern the Gaza Strip effectively and police corruption, which is a potential concern. President Trump is supposed to be, as the proponents of this proposal or the initiator of this proposal, would be the chairman of this board of peace, and then Tony Blair would be one member of this board, but not the only member. So he would play a role, yes, but he would not be, I think, the universal authority that the term governor of Gaza suggests. I don't think that's exactly the role that he would play. He would, however, be involved to some degree, more than likely, given the text of the plan. The last thing I'll note is that, of course, this comes with various promises to rebuild Gaza, provide for economic redevelopment and financing of the various rebuilding projects. So there's a lot of money that these countries would necessarily need to throw behind it. But it's a big deal. I mean, it's a very comprehensive plan in terms of it accounts for most of the problems that need to be solved. It doesn't necessarily provide detailed solutions to all the problems, but at the very least, it has put most, if not all, the problems on the table that people have been kind of scared to talk about up until this point.
Yeah, I think this is truly an incredible accomplishment in diplomacy. The fact that, especially coming after that last week, when the whole world basically condemned Israel, and by recognizing the Palestinian state last week at the United Nations, and new nations who did that. And if you didn't watch that episode, watch it. It's the episode from last week. And then the week after, the President of the United States is able to galvanize basically the entire Arab world, the important players, important Muslim countries like Turkey, Indonesia, Pakistan. It has European backing as well. So it's just a really like an amazing coalition to corner Hamas. So I think there are a lot of things that stand out to me. Two I'll mention right now. One is the issue of the PA, because for the last 2 years, Israelis have been theoretically discussing that this terrible choice of having to get rid of Hamas, but hand it to the PA, who is, it's not great. The Palestinian Authority. So this one makes the Palestinian Authority a part of this, a part, but they're not the ruling people in charge immediately. And second, according to the Times of Israel reports, that one of the things that Netanyahu was able to get when he went to the meeting with the president at the White House is that it's not just that they're going to grant amnesty to Hamas people, but it requires that they commit to peaceful coexistence and to decommission their weapons. So that was an important caveat reported by the Times of Israel. We're just not going to let these people get out of here. They need to commit to being peaceful and to give up their weapons. So this is a big accomplishment if they're able to make it through. I have other thoughts, but let's keep going because, it's like we talked last week about the recognition of the state of Palestine. Great. You guys want a peaceful state for Palestinian people right next to Israel. Please make sure to tell the leaders of the PA to accept this. In this case, the whole world agrees to it, basically the United States, Israel, European nations, Arab nations, Muslim nations. Now we just need to get Hamas to say yes to this. So, Josiah, tell us about that. Will they sign on to this?
It's a really interesting question. I don't know. I don't know right away whether they're going to or not. Initial reports suggest that they're under a lot of pressure. I think part of what does make this deal so interesting is the enthusiasm from the different Arab countries, but not just the Arab countries, specifically the countries that have some vested interest in working with Hamas or hosting Hamas or negotiating with Hamas. So, for example, it's a big deal, of course, that the Arab League has thrown its support behind this, that Pakistan and Indonesia have thrown their support behind it. But the fact that specifically Egypt and Qatar are both on board and are supposedly telling Hamas, you need to take this deal. And not just that, but also Turkey, because Turkey is not a member of the Arab League, but it is a major player in the Middle East and a country that has also in the past been kind of on again, off again in terms of its relationship with Hamas. In the last year was a temporary haven for Hamas when the Qataris briefly kicked them out and then took them back in. So Turkey does have some influence right now and a little bit of skin in the game as well. So the fact that there is so much enthusiasm from these countries, again, not just major Arab countries, but even other regional players like Turkey who Hamas listens to, all of them telling Hamas, you need to do this, that's a big deal. And I think there's a lot to be said for that. Now, the problem is that there are already reports coming out saying other terror factions in Gaza, like Islamic Jihad, no, it's a no from us. We're not going to accept this. And they're going to be putting pressure on Hamas as well. Hamas's military leadership in Gaza, according to various reports, is okay with the deal because they think the war needs to end and they probably recognize that it's not trending in a good direction the deeper that Israel pushes into Gaza City. But they're not the ones who have to actually negotiate this deal. The ones who have to negotiate the deal are the negotiators who live abroad. And let's not forget, these individuals have been very hardline about almost everything that is being asked of them up until this point. I mean, the deal would be an admission of surrender, not total, but almost total surrender for Hamas. So it would be a pretty tough pill for them to swallow. These individuals are also the ones who recently survived an assassination attempt by Israel in Doha. So they're not very motivated right now, frankly, to negotiate, despite all the pressure that they're facing. And rumor has it that they've already sort of indicated they're leaning towards not accepting the deal. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the deal doesn't move forward, because part of what's in the plan text basically is, okay, if Hamas refuses to move forward, no big deal. We move forward in the areas that Hamas doesn't control. Because at this point, Hamas doesn't control 80% of the Gaza Strip. And so the plan makes it pretty clear Israel will be given, more likely than not, a pretty blanket agreement or understanding that, yes, you can continue to prosecute the war against Hamas in that 20% of the Gaza Strip that they still control. Meanwhile, the 80% that Hamas does not control, we will go ahead and give to this international stabilization force. So that's a pretty big deal. I mean, it basically tells Hamas it's not up to you. I mean, you can accept the deal or not, but if you refuse the deal, we're going to start implementing various components of it anyways. And Israel is going to continue to have freedom to conduct its war against you in the small parts of the Gaza Strip that you still have access to. So it's
Josiah, do you feel like that caveat from Trump that if you don't accept this, I'm just gonna let Israel finish the job? That to me would sounds like Trump's saying that. I don't know if the European and the Arab nations will when Israel was about to go into Rafah 2 years ago, everybody was like, "Whoa, like don't do that." And now when Israel is going to Gaza City, there's a whole uproar in the world as well. So I'm not sure if Hamas rejects this. I think what I'm going to be hearing from European nations and Arab nations is just Israel ceasefire, stop it. I don't know if I'm going to hear Israel go ahead, finish the job.
It's a good question. Let me show you a map actually of what's happening in Gaza right now and sort of what this plan proposes Israel would necessarily need to do. This is in a perfect world. So in a perfect world, if the plan were implemented as drawn up, this is essentially what would happen. You would take Israel's current line of control essentially from here, which is the blue line, and then force it to move back first to the yellow line and then to this red line, and eventually the Israeli forces would remain in Gaza even when there is an international stabilization force, but only along the security perimeter, along the border of the Gaza Strip. So that's what's being proposed. Most of the major operation right now that's taking place is in Gaza City. So that is closer to this blue line. And if you're listening, I'm sorry you can't see this, but if you're on YouTube, you can see exactly what I'm talking about. The operation right now is within that first line. There are an additional 2 to 3 lines of withdrawal that the Israelis would have to move back from if this plan were implemented. Now, the assumption is that if Hamas refuses the deal, this map has to be redrawn, because you would give the International Stabilization Force a lot of the Gaza Strip, but you would have to allow Israel to sort of redraw the map a little bit so that they continue operating in Gaza City, which is well outside the area that they're supposed to withdraw to. That is assuming that President Trump gives them the go ahead. I think as it is written up, it's a little bit unclear if Israel would be guaranteed the right to keep fighting, but it does seem to imply that, because it says only that the 80% that Hamas does not currently control would be given over to the International Stabilization Force, meaning that the 20% is going to be considered an active war zone, not an area that is in a post-war state. The International Stabilization Force is only supposed to step in after the war ends. So it would seem to suggest that if that remaining 20% is not going to be given to that International Stabilization Force, it's because the countries that sign on all understand and acknowledge or accepting the fact that it will continue to exist in a state of war, and that Israel will have to continue to fight against Hamas. Now, again, this is going to have to be redrawn. This map is not going to make sense if Hamas refuses the deal, but I think that's the basic idea.
Yeah, I'm reading here the plan. It's point number 17. It says that in the event that Hamas delays or rejects this proposal, so if they reject it, all of the above, so all of the other 16 points, including the scaled up aid operation, will proceed in the terror-free areas handed over from the IDF to the International Stabilization Force. So the map that you just showed. So it does say that if Hamas rejects, they're just going to move on in those areas. And I guess we'll keep going. So again, in paper, in theory, since this has the backing of the Arab League and all these other important nations, it seems like they agreed to this. They agreed to let Israel continue if Hamas rejects. So this is different. Like, it is very different because it's really backing Hamas into a corner. I wanted to highlight something that I heard from, I think it was Amit Siegel on Call Me Back by Dan Senior. He said that he is, in his analysis, the fact that Israel did not have a successful assassination of the Hamas leaders in Qatar, and then, by the way, we should note that Prime Minister Netanyahu had to call the Prime Minister of Qatar and apologize to them. So he did that. He said
kind of.
Right. He said he didn't apologize. He said something like
he regretted the loss of life of his Qatari security guard, I think, but he didn't exactly apologize.
Right. And he said we were targeting Hamas, not Qatar, not Doha. So the fact that after that, Trump has made Israel promise that Hamas will not be targeted in Qatar, that means that Qatar only truly has a safe haven in Qatar. Hamas only has safe haven in Qatar, which means that they cannot go anywhere else because Israel will have free reign to pursue them anywhere else. So that means that Qatar has an increased leverage on Hamas at this point. They say, I'm the only party that can protect you. So you need to accept this or you out of options. You're going to be, and I think Trump still has more leverage, another card to play here. He could push Qatar to say, you need to kick them out. If they reject this, kick them out. And I think the United States should use that leverage to do that. What do you think about that?
I think this is one of the biggest question marks. And there's a list of questions that we probably should just throw on the table for people to think about. But one of the biggest question marks is, would the Qataris actually kick out Hamas if they said no to the deal? Because they're in a spot now where they have the full backing of and pressure from the United States to do just that. And it would make sense for them to do that given how they have approached these negotiations and the fact that they are throwing their support behind this plan. But are they actually willing to go through with it? Not super clear at the moment. So that's a pretty big question mark that is on the table.
Yeah. Well, I think we should say the obvious. As Christians, we do not agree with the president's assessment that this will create an eternal peace. He promised eternal peace if this deal of the century is accepted. But, Josiah, there are some gaps that need to be filled here. So what are the potential gaps that could make this deal make it or break it?
Yeah, I don't know if this is like make or break, but there's a few things that I think could jam things up a little bit. And it's important to just throw those issues on the table. One of those first issues is what exactly the role of the PA is and this idea of a Palestinian state. It's very interesting that a lot of these Arab countries, of course, and the vast majority of the world last week at the UN pushed forward this idea of a Palestinian state. Israel was very isolated diplomatically, and now it's flipped. Now Hamas is the one who's very isolated diplomatically. But what's interesting is that there is still this language in the peace plan about a Palestinian state, arguing that it doesn't promise a Palestinian state, but that there needs to be a credible pathway to a Palestinian state. It argues that the Palestinian Authority, after completing various reforms, should also be given a role to play and ideally control of the Gaza Strip. And that's going to be a very, very difficult sell to the Israeli public, particularly during an election season. It has the potential to bring down the Israeli government early. And so that's a very interesting issue to watch and just see, how do people interpret the language that's put in the plan? They're not going to interpret it the same way. Are they able to reconcile their different views of this? And you're already seeing various statements being made by the Qataris or the Egyptians about the role that they envision for a Palestinian state or the Palestinian Authority that do not match the exact text of the plan or the Israeli statements about the plan. And so clearly there's some differences that are going to have to be resolved around that in order for everyone to stay on board. And this plan needs as many countries as possible to stay on board if it's going to work. You also have, I think, some pretty significant questions about the humanitarian aid issue. So the text of the plan, rather, seems to say, not explicitly, but it's heavily implied or suggested that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is out, because it says that any humanitarian organizations that are associated with either side of the conflict are not to play a role in providing humanitarian aid after the war is over. That responsibility is to be returned to UN agencies and the Red Crescent. Which UN agencies? I mean, this is, I think, a very important question. Which UN agencies are we talking about? What is the relationship that they're going to have to Hamas, even Hamas members who accept amnesty, to this new transitional political committee running the Gaza Strip, to the Palestinian Authority? I mean, there's so many questions about how this is going to work. Who exactly are you going to invite to take responsibility for humanitarian aid, and how are they going to relate to the new governing powers and be held accountable to not allow Hamas back into the picture at some point? So that's, I think, going to be very important that is clarified. It's also, I think, just fascinating that in this agreement, there are multiple references to this idea of education for peace, interfaith dialogue, political dialogue between Israelis and Palestinians. Who's actually going to be responsible for that? Who's going to make sure that it happens? Who's going to design that? Who's going to facilitate that? I mean, those are great, very aspirational ideas, but they're very light on detail in the plan, I think intentionally so. It's the kind of language that you have to put in there in order to convince some of these countries to go along with this plan. But there's no real substance to how this would actually work. And so there's a lot of questions about what's the substance here. You also, I think I have questions about where are you going to find quote unquote apolitical Palestinians who can
Right.
run this transitional committee, a Palestinian who's not associated with Fatah or Hamas. Formally speaking, next to, I mean, it would be, it's possible that you could find someone who's not formally associated with either
There's
Fatah
some
or Hamas.
abroad, some here in
Right.
America.
But practically speaking, even if you can find someone who's not formally associated with Fatah or Hamas, I mean, realistically, you're not going to find someone who does not have a side or has not chosen a side in this Palestinian civil war of sorts that's been fought for the last 20 years. So that's, I think, just another example of, okay, this plan sounds great. A lot of potential, especially if everyone continues to throw their weight behind it and put pressure on everyone involved. But realistically, how is this actually going to work? There's a bit of a lack of substance on some of these points that I think are going to need to be clarified and explained a bit more thoroughly if they're going to work.
Yeah. I thank you for that. I think there's a lot of still question, and even earlier reporting from today, I saw this on Fox News that they're already saying Hamas is like, oh, we need a ceasefire, we need a pause in strike so that we can go find the hostages because we don't know where they are. So they're gonna be playing this game. I think Habib Ratif Gul in his podcast, he said that what he expects from Hamas is that if they accept this, to save face, they might just do more of this spectacle of delivering the hostages in a demeaning way to say, like, look at us, we won, we got. By the way, we forgot to mention, Josiah, I don't know if we did, that 250 terrorists from Israel who are in Israeli prisons right now will be released in this deal. These are people with life sentences who have done terror attacks. According to, I think, Nadaf, there are 290 people in Israeli jails with life sentences. So Israel will be given 250 of them. Plus, I think like 1,200 Gazans who have been detained, they will also be exchanged. So we can expect Hamas to make a whole show of that. And then one last thing, the thing that gave me hope about this came from Laser Behrman from the Times of Israel. He's the analyst there. He said that Hamas is actually way more popular in the West Bank today than in Gaza itself. So one of the ways that he can see them saving face and being able to agree with this is finding like, you know what, we're going to give up Gaza, big deal, and we're going to try to reconstitute ourselves in the West Bank and go from there and then like continue to exist that way. This is so because again, we need to get into the mindset of these terrorists. Like they have little incentive to not fight until they die. So I think this could be a way. What do you think about that? Like maybe what do you think about this analysis that, all right, let's just move to the West Bank. Let's do this deal. Let's finish this war.
Yeah, I think the PA is weak enough in the West Bank already. That is probably the nightmare scenario for Israel and a realistic goal of Hamas. That you go to the West Bank where the PA sits, you continue to work behind the scenes to topple the PA or to weaken the PA, garner more support for yourself from the West Bank. And one of the concerns that's been coming up in the last couple of weeks, and we talked a bit about this with our guest a week and a half ago, Elliot Abrams, is that there's a very long border with Jordan, which is relatively open and hard to secure. And weapons smuggling is not impossible through a border that is that long. It'd be easy for Hamas to reconstitute themselves. There's even some reports that the Houthis have been training for some sort of cross-border invasion where they might travel from Yemen to Jordan and then invade the Israeli territory through this border with Jordan. A lot of future conflicts could be fought in the West Bank if Hamas chose to refocus their operations there. That's not out of the question at all. And it's something that Israel is already, I think, aware of and thinking about.
Yeah. Okay, well, Josiah, thank you for this, guys. We'll keep an eye out on this. By the time of that you're listening, watching this, it is Yom Kippur in Israel, so we'll expect the news to probably be quiet for a couple of days. We should say that President Trump did say earlier this week that he'll give them 3 or 4 days to make a decision. I think President Trump wants a decision by October 7th, which is next week. And I think Israelis would at least want this by the holiday of Simchat Torah, which is the last day of the holidays, the day that October 7th happened in the Hebrew calendar. But we have a lot to pray for. Before we move into that, Josiah, let me ask you some rapid fire questions coming from our audience. Thank you so much for submitting your questions, y'all. Please continue to do so. I got a question here from Ben in reference to Palestinian recognition. So this is something that we talked about last week about the recognition of Palestinian statehood. How reversible is this policy? For example, if a different party were to take leadership in Canada in the next election, would they be able to change course, or would the steps required be prohibitive? I think Ben is based in Canada.
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. And part of why he's probably asking this question is because there are some countries that have opposition parties already saying once we get the government back in our country, we're going to reverse our country's policy. And so the question is, can you actually do that? How easy is it to do that? Legally speaking, it's hard to take it back. As part of international law, we talked last week about the Montevideo Declaration on the Rights and Duties of States, and part of what it spells out is how do you recognize a state. One of the phrases in there or clauses in there that's important is this idea that you can't really take it back. Recognizing a state, legally speaking, under international law, typically that's considered to be irrevocable unless they have just completely failed for some reason as a state. So that's an interesting hypothetical, because you could make the argument that Palestine didn't reach the threshold to become a state in the first place, or didn't meet the criteria in the first place. So maybe legally you could revoke it. It would still be, I think, challenging to do so. Practically speaking, however, very easy to do that, because all you really have to do is cut off diplomatic relations, stop cooperating with Palestine, recall your ambassador to Palestine, something like that. And even if you legally recognize them as a state, practically you don't. And all the benefits have been taken away, which is probably what they would, I would assume, prioritize or focus on.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Ben, for your question. Let's move to Emily. Emily asks, what are some ways that leadership and civilians alike can promote peace and prevent the reoccurrence of violence and war? It's a big question, Josiah.
Yeah, I think this is where I have a lot of questions about this peace plan, because peace plans are good, especially aspirational peace plans. They should shoot for the stars. And at the same time, they have to be pragmatic. I think the conflict goes very, very deep into issues of entrenched collective memory about the conflict, very different versions of the story that both sides of the conflict are telling themselves. And yet it's very difficult to work beyond that, but you have to in order to actually create a peace that people will accept, because an imposed peace is not a real peace. It's just kind of a ceasefire, if you will. So I think we have to think about that and wrestle with that, both leaders and civilians, that any peace that we attempt to impose is not likely to last unless there is some changing of hearts and minds about the nature of the conflict and convincing people that peace is actually a good thing, which the peace plan recognizes, but again, is a little light on substance. So I think leaders are going to have to figure that out, come up with some very practical ways that they can create that space for re-educating people about the conflict and about the need for peace, and getting on the same page about what version of the story are we going to tell ourselves about this conflict that allows us to make peace with the enemy. You're also, I think, going to have to find among civilians, we don't have the responsibility necessary to carry out the specific details of this plan, but we do have the responsibility to speak up for what we think is right and is important. And I think it's important that we speak up about this, that we speak up about the need for this education component of the plan, not to just be forgotten about or kind of pushed to the side when we focus on other things. No, I think it needs to be front and center. How are we going to address this? And putting pressure on our leaders to focus on that and come up with some good ideas and actionable solutions for this. I think we need to be committed to the truth and thinking critically about these things, and forcing our leaders, or putting pressure on our leaders to do the same. And not forget about this, because I think it is really at the crux of whether this plan will work or not. At the same time, if I take a step back, I think it's also important to praise our leaders for coming up with these aspirational plans and pushing for peace, but also remind ourselves and our leaders that at the end of the day, we also need to see small wins. Even if this plan doesn't work, we need to still pursue pragmatic solutions for as many of the problems as possible, even if we can't solve them all at the same time, and allowing ourselves that tension to dream big and to do the grunt work of making people's lives better, even if we can't solve everything all at once. It's important. We have to have that mindset as people, and we have to use our influence over our leaders and to push them to think in the same way. So that's my fast reaction to that question. But thank you for that question, Emily.
Yeah, it's a big question. I would say, I think one of the things that we can do over here in the United States is to promote dialogue. Let's say the late Charlie Kirk would say that when people stop talking, countries go to war. So I think I want to actually give a shout out here to our Passages Fellows. We have these campus fellows. We have 20 of them in 20 different campuses who are doing advocacy. Over the last week, like 8 of them had Shabbat dinners where they got together with the Christian students on campus from Princeton, Canada. We had one at Oral Roberts University, Regent, a bunch of different schools where they just had Shabbat dinner with Jewish friends, get to know each other. There's one at DTS, Dallas Theological Seminary, this weekend. So I want to give you guys, campus fellows, a shout out. You are doing, you're peacemakers. You are bringing Jewish and Christian people together, and you're educating your communities about Israel. I want to say I used to be a very anti-Israel person who believed in war, in resistance, in violence as a means to the end of the liberation of Palestine. And if you want to learn more about that, go to episode 1 of this podcast, and you'll hear that story. But a person reached out to me, educated me about Israel, and here I am now, no longer promoting violence. So I think we should let's think about how we should pray. So shout out to our campus fellows, and hey, especially shout out to Maggie in Dallas, who told me how much this podcast has helped you. Maggie, thank you for listening. So how should we pray? I think the Bible commands us, for instance, or commanded the people of Israel in the Bible to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. So that commandment was given to the people of Israel, and I think we should take on that responsibility. Pray for Israel. Pray for the peace of the region. Also, blessed are the peacemakers. Let's be thankful for the unique opportunity. Whatever you think about Donald Trump, he is the person right now who has the leverage to make something like this happen. Many other kinds of presidents would not be able to do this. So grateful that the United States has a role to play in this end to this war. What a blessing it is for our country to be able politically to get peace done around the world. So let's pray that this peace effort will be accepted. And we should pray like the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh to not let the people of Israel go. The Lord softened the heart of Cyrus to let the people of Israel or Judah return to their land. So the Bible says in Proverbs that the heart of the king is like water in the hands of God. He changes wherever he wants him to go. So let's pray that God will soften the heart of these leaders who are having to make the decision to say yes or no to this peace deal. Let's pray that God will soften their hearts, that they will give up, that enough is enough. Many of these people involved in these decisions have had family members killed, close relatives killed. Let's pray that God will soften their hearts and they'll give up this war. This war has been such a distraction around the world. It has brought so many protests, unrest, also around the region, even for trade. Look what the Houthis are doing in the ocean. So if this conflict comes to an end, true peace in many aspects will come. The world will be a more peaceful state. And I think after 2 years is enough. So let's pray that the Lord will let us see this miracle, that what they meant for evil, God meant for good, and Israel will be better off after this. And the region and the Palestinian people will be better off without Hamas as well. So those are my prayer points, Josiah. What do you got?
No, I don't think I have anything to add, Sebastian. I think it would echo all of that, especially just the importance of praying not just for peace, but also for our leaders.
Okay. All right. Well, friends, thank you so much for listening. We'll be back here next week. Thank you for listening to the Passages Pulse. Let us know if you have any questions. Drop it in the comment. We'll address them at a future episode. Safety to all you all. Bye. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Passages Pulse. Help us grow this community by liking, sharing, and subscribing. If you like this week's episode, let us know by leaving a comment below. This podcast is a project of Passages Israel. We exist to educate the next generation of Christians on modern Israel, deepen the roots of their faith, and equip leaders to foster positive Christian engagement with Israel and the Jewish people. To learn more about Passages, follow us on social media or visit us at passagesisrael.org. Until next time, we'll keep our finger on the pulse.